Hello, and welcome back to our series on human resource management. Today we're going to be talking about managing a global workforce. Now, just so you know, there's way too much to cover in just one simple video when it comes to managing employees and organizations across the globe, but we'll go ahead and touch on a few of the key points. So with that, let's go ahead and get in there. Okay, so managing HR globally. Now, like I just said, there is way too much to cover. I mean, let's face it, HR globally is the same as HR locally or nationally. There's still hiring, there's still recruiting, there's still project management, there's still performance management, there's still training, there's still development. All these things are done globally, but they have different nuance, different flavor, different taste. And so really it depends on where you are doing business to figure out how to approach each one of these HR facets. Nevertheless, we are going to touch upon a few things in this video. Specifically, I want to talk about staffing global organizations. There are, in fact, 3 different approaches that organizations can take when figuring out how to staff a global corporation, multinational organization, what have you. Okay, so the first approach is called the Ethnocentric Approach. In this approach, companies fill international positions, key leadership international positions, with parent company nationals. Meaning, if you are a U.S. company, you send your U.S. employees out to manage these international locations. It's very much a sort of, hey, the way we do things is the right way to do things, and we want to make sure that everybody does it the right way. Now, there are some advantages, some pros to the ethnocentric approach. One is you can fill skills gaps that may exist where you're doing business. You can also help transfer core competencies to that host country. It also helps to maintain a unified corporate culture. If all your key leadership positions are held by people from the original national headquarter country, then the corporate culture is going to remain pretty constant. There are, however, some cons to this. First of all, it really brings about resentment in the host country. It's kind of like saying, oh, you little people, you don't know how to run this. We are going to come out and do it for you while we make money off of your fellow nationals. They don't really like that. And it can also lead to cultural myopia, meaning, this maintaining of corporate culture that we talked about. Well, it kind of suggests that this is the one and only corporate culture that could possibly be successful. And so it doesn't really allow for growth or development or evolution in corporate culture. The second approach is the Polycentric Approach. This is where companies require that host country nationals manage the subsidiaries while the parent company nationals occupy key positions but back at corporate headquarters. So I'll give you an example. I'm a U.S. company, but I'm doing business off in, let's say, Malaysia. Well, I'm going to make sure that that Malaysian branch is staffed by all Malaysians, including the manager of that subsidiary of that branch. However, back in the US, I'm going to be watching them very carefully. I'm going to occupy key positions over here to make sure that they kind of stay on the straight and narrow. So yes, it's better than the ethnocentric approach in that they're running their own subsidiary, but it's with a great deal of oversight. Once again, this polycentric approach has pros and cons. It reduces that risk of cultural myopia that I talked about. It does allow for the culture, the corporate culture, to evolve and change. And it's also less expensive. You don't have to send people out from the US to Malaysia in this particular example. You can go ahead and manage things from back in the US, so it's less expensive. Now, there are cons though. it still produces some level of resentment because the folks over in Malaysia, while they are running that subsidiary, they know that they will never get past that subsidiary. They are Malaysians working in Malaysia at the Malaysian subsidiary. And so their careers are pretty, trammeled by that. It also isolates foreign subsidiaries from the corporate headquarters. Now, what I mean by this is all the action is happening at corporate headquarters. That's where decisions are being made. That's where networks are being created. That's where everything is going down. And folks that work outside of that corporate headquarters can sometimes feel like the forgotten red-headed stepchild. They're not really in the game. Now, the third approach is the geocentric approach. And this one is simply saying that a company will fill all the positions with the very best talent they have, regardless of nationalities. If I'm going to send Americans to Malaysia, fine. If I'm going to send Malaysians to the US, you bet. I can send Malaysians off to Venezuela. I can send Costa Ricans to the US. You get the idea. It's just whatever talent you need, you find it no matter where it is, and you take that talent and move it to where it's needed. Now, there are, of course, pros and cons. The pros here is that this uses human resources very efficiently. You find the right skills, you match them with the right needs, you make the move, you're good to go. It also builds a very strong culture. Since everybody is moving around and intermingling, that culture is pretty solid. It also builds informal management networks, meaning, hey, anybody can be anywhere. Everybody has opportunity. Your network can grow and expand, and this can have ramifications for you later on down the track. There are also cons, though. Immigration laws may make this pretty complicated. You might have to look at H-1B visas and so forth. You can't just pick up and move people. Immigration laws, which differ from country to country, may get in the way. Also, this is a very expensive approach to take because you're moving everybody everywhere to live in different countries, and that's expensive. Now, when I worked for Intel Corporation, Intel very much followed the geocentric approach. I could go to an Intel site in Malaysia, or in India, or in the US, or in China, or just about anywhere, and unless I looked outside, I could almost not know where I was because there were so many cultures around me no matter where I went. But that brings us to the topic of expatriates or expats. Now, just a little story. When I was a kid living in London, my mother said one time, oh yeah, this area over here, this is where the expats hang out. And I was like, expats? And yeah, expatriates. Well, I heard expatriate, as in they are no longer patriotic to the United States. They are expatriates. Of course, what? I'm 13 years old. I don't know the difference. And I'm like, oh, why would they do that? No. Expatriates is completely different. That's what we're going to talk about here. So an expatriate or an expat and third country nationals are people who are from one country but are working in another. So an expat is a citizen of one country working abroad in another. So, for example, I'm from the United States. I worked for Intel Corporation, a U.S. company, but I did a short expat assignment in Malaysia. Therefore, I am a citizen of one country working abroad in another. I was an expat. However, there's also third country national. This is a citizen of one country working in a second country, employed by an organization headquartered in a third country. So, for instance, this picture that you see posted up here, you see all these folks from India because this is the Intel site in India, bunch of awesome folks. Well, right down there in the bottom left, you see this somewhat Caucasian guy. Well, he was an Israeli citizen. but they're working for Intel, which is a US company. So in this example, this individual here from Israel, he is a third country national because he's Israeli working in India for a US company. Now, being an expat is awesome. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's fantastic and so forth, but it does come with risk. So the attrition rate among expat managers is nearly twice as high as that of domestic managers. This is because expat managers are under a great deal more pressure than just somebody working in their home country. There's a variety of reasons for this. Inability for the spouse to adjust. Yeah, it's one thing if the expat goes over there and works with people with whom he or she is used to working and at a site that looks like every other site for their company, but the spouse is back in some apartment or hotel in a foreign country with no network, nobody to really commiserate with. It's actually very, very challenging for the spouse. There's also sometimes an inability for the manager to adjust. It's really tough to live in a foreign country. Also, manager personal or emotional maturity really comes into play here. You have to exercise a much higher level of emotional maturity and emotional intelligence to be successful working abroad. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, inability to cope with larger overseas responsibilities. When companies send you to live abroad, they are investing a lot of money in you and they want that money back. They want you working, oh my gosh, easily 80-hour weeks, hands down. And they want you to wear a lot of hats because, again, they want a return on their investment. So the level of responsibility among expat managers is much higher than those working back domestically. So what are you going to do to mitigate for all these risks? Well, you're going to offer training. So let's talk about some of the training we can deliver to our expats. First, absolutely, cultural training. This is mandatory. Now, culture here, it's a system of values and norms shared among a group of people that directs and justifies how the members operate, live, and behave. We're going to talk about this. Culture includes just about everything: religion, political philosophy, economic philosophy, communication, social structure, history, customs, traditions, stories, mythologies, you name it, it's all involved in culture. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to dig just a little bit deeper into values, norms, folkways, and mores. Now, values are principles that a society believes to be good, right, and desirable. So, for instance, here in the United States, individual freedom, just autonomy, the ability of somebody to go out and forge his or her own path, that is a value that is very American. It's something that we feel is good, right, and desirable. However, not all countries put equal value on individual autonomy and ambition and entrepreneurship. Some are much more collective in nature, and so the values will be different. Then we have norms. These are social rules and guidelines that prescribe appropriate behaviors. For example, here in the United States, when we speak with somebody, we look them in the eye. It's eye-to-eye contact. That's a way of showing that we're paying attention, that we're respecting what they're saying, that we are engaged in the conversation. Well, that's all well and good. However, eye contact is not universally seen as a positive thing. In some countries, eye contact could be perceived as aggressive or negative or very uncomfortable. So there are certain social rules that for one country feel very normal and appropriate. They're the norms after all, but in another country are inappropriate. Then we have folkways. These are routine conventions and customs of everyday life, just things we do because it's just tradition, it's a custom. For instance, holding the door open for somebody, or giving up your seat on the train. These are just normal things that many folks in the U.S. do. However, not all folkways are held universally across the world. Different cultures put emphasis on different folkways, and that can create some anxiety if we do not know what different countries value in terms of their everyday customs and routines. Finally, we have mores. These are seen as central to the functioning of society, the breaking of which is taboo. It's, you don't mess with this. It's just, you don't even want to think about it, right? They are seen as so abhorrent among society. For instance, here in the US, the idea of abusing animals and so forth, you just not cool, man. Well, but in different areas of the world, there's different emphasis placed on animals. Some see them as much more sacred even than we do. For example, here in the US, we go ahead and eat meat, we eat beef, we eat hamburgers, we eat all kinds of beef, and yet in India, cows are seen as sacred animals. Well, eating of a cow can be, it's just mind-boggling to somebody who sees it as a sacred animal. So these are examples of how mores are not even seen as universally applicable. Okay, so that's culture, but then there's also language training. Now here's the thing about language. Yes, I will say that in much of the industrialized world, English is kind of seen as the language of business. Okay, fine. So then it's really tempting to say, oh, I don't need to learn any languages. No, not the case. It is true that much of your business will likely be conducted in English. However, by learning some of the language and using some of their terms and phrases, you are reaching out to these people, to your host nation. You're showing them that you are willing to go out of your way to connect with them on a very real human level. There's nothing more human than connecting over communication. And so when we take a humble approach and learn some of the local language and try to use it in our day-to-day conversations, it really goes a long way in saying that you're here for them, that you are humble, that you are not exercising hubris, that you see value in their ways and their customs and their language. And then there's things like practical training. Just simply, how do you get around? How do you buy something at a store? How do you get an ID card? How do you do just about anything? When you really think about it, so much of our lives is dictated by how we do things in our particular culture. But if you go to another culture with different systems, you would be pretty much completely lost. In the same way, it is very important that family members are included in this practical training. Because if you remember, one of the things that causes expat managers to fail is when their spouses are unable to adapt. Well, it's actually much more difficult and challenging for the spouse because he or she is the one who has to deal with all the practical issues of living abroad. And so it's important that they get this training as well. And so that is a very quick view of some of the aspects of running an HR organization globally. I know we didn't go over even a smidge of all the other things, but at least it gives you some sort of taste and flavor for the opportunity that's out there. All right, so now you have just a little bit of an idea of what it's like to staff a global organization. Like I said, there's a whole lot more that goes into managing a global HR organization, but that's for a different time. And I think that wraps up this series. Oh my gosh, if you've stuck with me through all this, congratulations, you are a singular human being. I hope you've gotten something out of it. I hope you've enjoyed a few moments of it. And most especially, I hope you have a fantastic day. We'll see you later.